Gold Coast, West Africa, 1824. God, you hate this stinking jungle. The strange smells, the oppressive heat, the fact you can barely see anything through the thick green foliage. You're a British soldier sent to West Africa as a punishment for repeated drunkenness on duty. This was meant to be an easy mission to crush an African tribe, but now only your guns and the river in front of you are holding back tens of thousands of warriors from massacring your small force. The natives' guns boom out like blunderbusses, the noise echoing off the trees, while filling the battlefield with heavy smoke, adding to the poor visibility. And always the drums, those terrible drums, playing their mad rhythm. A nearby soldier screams as a bullet hits his leg, only falling silent when another enters his head. You fire back, but it's like shooting at shadows as the warriors move around in the bush. Only when they try to charge across the river do you finally have proper targets to kill. The drum's rhythm becomes even more crazy as they wade across, screaming out their war cries. You pour bullets into their ranks, and many fall, but still they come, only retreating when the river runs red with their blood. You're running low on ammunition and cursing the lateness of the quartermaster when he suddenly emerges from the jungle, looking exhausted and hauling crates of bullets. You race over and help to open a box, only to recoil in horror at the sight. Those aren't bullets. Instead, the crate is filled with dry macaroni. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Da wird uns ausgebildet. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. While many British generals have died in combat, very few have actually lost their heads, and only one unfortunate soul's head was displayed in triumph as a trophy by tribal warriors. How our British army was destroyed and its general beheaded is a story of incompetence, arrogance and mission creep, as the British Empire encountered the most formidable army in West Africa, the Ashanti. In the early 19th century, West Africa was a bit of a mystery to Westerners. Its interior was a largely unknown land of sweltering temperatures, malarial swamps, deep jungles and hostile tribes, where most white men feared to tread. Their knowledge was limited to the small trading forts and occasional colonies that clung to the coastline. For Britain, it was very much an imperial backwater. Soldiers were stationed here as a punishment post, while it was officered and staffed by a mixture of dullards, crooks and incompetents. People who were too well connected or too much work to get rid of, so they were dumped somewhere they couldn't cause trouble. Those Europeans that were drawn to West Africa were a motley crew of slavers, merchants, fortune hunters and adventurers. Their primary target was the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana. English, Dutch, Danes, French, Swedes, and even Prussians from Brandenburg were all trying their luck here, trading with the natives for gold, ivory, and especially slaves. It was a rough and ready anything-goes, violent kind of life, with the whole coast resembling the Mos Eisley Cantina in Star Wars. Britain's interests were represented by the African Company of Merchants, a truly shady institution. After Britain banned the slave trade in 1807, the African Company kept on quite happily selling slaves, despite numerous complaints from London. If the Gold Coast traders had had an official motto, it would have been, "Anything for a profit." As the official neglect and rampant pursuit of money went on, something was stirring, deep in the jungles of the interior that would threaten this cozy world. A mighty empire was on the rise, feared and loathed by the other tribes, a seemingly invincible force that mercilessly crushed all those who challenged them. The British had only heard whispers of their existence, a name mentioned with dread: Ashanti. Like many an apex predator, the Ashanti had begun life dominated by others. Formerly a fractured and divided people, they were ruled by a more powerful tribe. Even the name Ashanti was given to them by their overlords, meaning diggers of red mud after the clay they sent in tribute. Then the heavens intervened, or at least one very cunning chief did. He claimed that a golden stool had come down from the sky, and inside it were all the spirits of the Ashanti ancestors. They were now a chosen people, destined to unite and throw off their shackles. The prophecy foretold by the chief, or by the heavens, came to pass. The Ashanti massacred their overlords and began building their own empire, while the golden stool became the most precious object in their culture. As their empire grew, they forged the most formidable and sophisticated army in all of West Africa. The nucleus of this army was a small, trained force that guarded the capital, Kumasi, and of course, the golden stool, upon which the very survival of the empire relied. When war came, they would call up a portion of able-bodied men from each of the 24 sub-chiefs and vassal states, but carefully made sure that enough were left behind to keep the farms running and prevent famine. They even had their own medical orderlies, unique among all the armies of Africa, to look after the wounded and carry off the dead. It was entirely composed of infantry, as horses stood no chance against the lethal tsetse fly. They were not armed with spears, but with guns from European merchants. These were called Long Danes, as allegedly the Danes had first introduced them to the Gold Coast. It was over 6 foot in length and weighed 20 pounds. A more unsuitable musket for jungle warfare could not have been designed. They were rarely accurate beyond 30 yards, and were unlikely to hurt anyone unless at close range. While their rifles were poor, the Ashanti showed great creativity in overcoming this problem. Unlike all the other armies of Africa, they fired from the shoulder and practiced marksmanship. They could perform fire drills and shoot from any position, even crouching and lying down. This made them surprisingly lethal. In the thick jungles of West Africa, they could blend into the terrain, all the while sniping at their enemy. They were so successful at using the jungle that they could sneak close enough to a foe for their rifles to become effective. Their enemies would face an almost invisible army, peppering them with surprisingly accurate bullets. While they struggled to find a target to retaliate against, Ashanti war drums would echo throughout the forest, combined with the loud booms and clouds of smoke from the Long Dane rifles. It was enough to make many tribal armies break and run, only to find the Ashanti had also secretly manoeuvred behind them to cut off their retreat and create a killing zone. Once victorious, the warriors would cut off the heads of the dead as trophies and sacrifice any prisoners to their ancestral spirits. It was the best army in West Africa, surprisingly sophisticated and well run. The British would later admit the Ashanti were at least a century ahead of all the other tribes. Previously solely an inland empire, their eyes were now turning towards the Gold Coast. They wanted direct access to European traders, especially the guns they sold. Their chance came after a local rebellion in their vast empire. The Ashantis were constantly mounting expeditions to put down rebellions by kings and chieftains in their vassal states. It happened all the time because their kings, according to one British official, quote, established no garrisons in the conquered territories, appointed no governors or residents, and did not attempt in the least to blend with the people. The Ashanti kingdom resembled a loosely united bunch of sticks, which any severe shock might cause to fall to pieces. End quote. The stick causing the shock in 1805 had been a disturbance in the vassal state of Asin, south of Kumasi, where a chief rifled gold ornaments from the grave of another chief. Relatives of the dead chief complained to the Ashanti king. In the turmoil that followed, a number of Ashanti messengers were murdered, their mutilated bodies suspended from trees, and a golden axe of the Ashanti was stolen. They mobilized a huge army and marched against the rebellious Asins, killing 30,000 of them before it was all over. The coastal Fanti tribe gave refuge to some of the Asin survivors, including 2 chiefs, Chibu and Apatai, who stood at the top of the Ashanti most wanted list. It was a foolish act. They brought the wrath of the great king down upon themselves. Those that were left after the slaughter, including Chibu and Apatai, made their way to the little British fort at Anamambo, where the British took them in. The British commander at Anamambo, Edward William White, had no idea what a mistake he had just made. Having spent 25 years in West Africa, he had never even heard of the Ashanti before. He assumed they were similar to other tribes that he had been able to overawe easily. Unaware of just how advanced and lethal the military machine before him was. As thousands of Ashanti warriors gathered around the fort, he allowed in the elderly and young children from the Fanti, with the rest cowering beneath its walls. White contemptuously dismissed these so-called Ashantis as ignorant savages, declaring confidently, quote, that a few discharges of cannon would suffice to put them to rout, end quote. The cannons were fired, and to his horror, the mysterious warriors did not run away. Instead, with a terrible scream, they charged forward. From all directions the Ashantis poured into the town. The wretched Fantis fled in terror towards the beach, hoping to be able to escape in their canoes, but the enemy pursued too closely, and a terrible slaughter took place on the sands. Meanwhile, in the fort, the defenders still had their own problems. The entire garrison consisted of just White, 4 officers, and 24 soldiers, company slaves, and boys. Ashanti bullets raked the battlements as the British cannons roared back in response. Fire! Roars White as your cannon spits out a wave of lethal grape shot, tearing into the torsos and limbs of the screaming natives. The dead and wounded litter the ground, but soon disappear as hundreds more warriors surge forward to take their place. Reload! The beating sun roasts your skin, where your eyes sting from the clouds of gunpowder. Bullets ricochet off the battlements in front of you. Quickly ducking, you feel a bullet just miss your head. Your fellow gunner, midway through putting in more grape shot, isn't so lucky, holding his stomach, his eyes dimming as he slides to the floor. White is also injured, clutching his left arm, crimson red blood starting to stain his shirt. He still has the energy to scream, "Come on, man! Fire the cannon, damned you!" Leaping into action, you finish preparing the gun, and it roars out its defiance. Cutting a swathe through the densely packed warriors. Their bodies are relentlessly piling up, but still they come. Reaching the fort walls, they start seizing the terrified and shrieking women that have taken shelter there. Before you can reload the cannon, a bullet smashes into White's mouth. As he is carried off in agony, he spits out blood and mumbles something at you. You can't make out his words, but you know from his eyes what he said. Prepping the cannon, you light the fuse, and it belches out grape shot again. Today, you will win and survive, or lose and die. There is no in between. Poor White was really shot in the left arm and the mouth, losing 4 teeth. The remaining defenders were in truly desperate straits as the whole might of the Ashanti army threw themselves against the fort. Thankfully for the defenders, the walls were too high to be scaled, and the 2 gates were too heavily barricaded to be forced. The Ashanti finally broke off at 6 p.m., by which time only 8 men in the garrison were still standing. The terrified survivors were unable to get any sleep as the Ashanti war drums boomed out and the screams of their victims filled the night. A survivor described the next day, quote, "Day dawned upon a horrible scene of bloodshed and devastation. 8,000 Fantis had perished, most of them in the vicinity of the fort. Heaps of dead encumbered the beach in every direction, or were washed hither and thither in the surf, and the sands were red with blood." End quote. 10,000 Fantis had been killed already. The fort was jammed with 2,000 refugees, and 200 more were clinging to a rock a few yards from shore. That's all that was left of the local population. Soon after daybreak, the Ashantis attacked again. The eastern defences stood firm as their cannons delivered lethal hailstorms of grape shot into the Ashanti ranks. On the western side, however, the defenders abandoned their artillery as Ashanti fire was too lethally accurate. Instead, 2 officers, Meredith and Swansea, defended here armed only with their muskets. The warriors were so close and packed together that the 2 British officers often killed more than one victim at a time. Their musket balls would penetrate one warrior and then pass straight into the next. They fired over 300 rounds between them until their shoulders were so bruised by the recoil of their rifles that they could fire no more. Just when the end seemed certain, deliverance for the desperate garrison arrived in the form of 2 vessels from the main British fort, Cape Coast Castle. 3 officers, a corporal and 12 men were landed under the smoke from the guns and managed to reach the fort without being attacked. A truce was arranged, and the British Colonel Torrance entered the picture. Torrance was a crook. There is no way around it. He's the kind of guy you wouldn't want to buy a second-hand car from. The agreement he signed with the Ashanti king, Ose Tutukwame, would be a complete surrender. They would pay rent to the Ashanti for their forts and hand over the 2 most wanted rebel chiefs. This part of the agreement was probably inevitable. Britain didn't want a full-scale war and was outmatched with the scant resources it had on the Gold Coast. That said, Torrance was way too eager to give away the farm. He even offered up the rebel chiefs before the Ashanti even asked for them. One managed to escape, but the other was handed over to be slowly tortured to death. Later his jawbone would be suspended as a trophy from the king's death horn. Now that's a cool name, but its purpose was only ceremonial. The king blew the death horn at the funerals of royalty. The truly inexcusable part of this deal was the fate of the 2,000 refugees still in the fort. They decided to split the difference, 1,000 for the great king, and 1,000 to remain protected in the fort. Many of those who fell to the Ashantis were offered up as human sacrifices. The rest were sold as slaves. Okay, not great. But at least Torrance saved 1,000, right? Right? No. The despicable Torrance took his 1,000 prisoners and began selling them to slave traders. When John Swansea, the governor of Accra, heard what he was up to, he climbed out of his sickbed and travelled by canoe to Cape Coast to protest. A few of the refugees remained unsold, and Torrance, frightened by Swansea's threat to expose his dealings, released them. The rest were shipped to the New World in chains. Torrance later claimed he used the money from selling slaves to fund missionary work in the Gold Coast. This was a complete lie. He pocketed his ill-gotten gains. The Ashanti Empire had finally spread to the sea. Their great king now swam in the ocean to symbolically show off their triumph, taking the name Bonzu, or whale. They fought one last battle with the Fantis, destroying that nation as a fighting unit forever, and then their troops, weary and sick from smallpox, withdrew back to Kumasi. The two great empires have finally met, and really, it was 1-0 to the Ashanti. For now, the British merchants and government would try and placate them, but there were two big problems that would put these empires on the road to war. The first was that both sides were confused about their relationship status. Let me explain. The Ashanti had an essentially feudal mindset, just as complex and arcane as medieval Europe's. By their logic, Torrance's agreement to pay rent for the forts meant Britain now owed certain feudal dues to Kumasi. The main one was that they were now responsible for the good behaviour of the coastal tribes, making sure they paid their tribute regularly and on time. Britain's view was unsurprisingly very different. The Gold Coast was still a backwater of a backwater to them. Britain just wanted to support its merchants at the smallest possible cost, not get involved in tribal feuds and politics. Heavily indebted after the Napoleonic Wars, London barely tolerated paying rent for the forts, let alone policing the Gold Coast. This would lead to many a misunderstanding and allowed a drift into war. The second problem was slavery. In fits and starts, Britain would start cracking down on the slave trade. For now, the merchants on the coast are quite happy to turn a blind eye and profit from the trade, as per the odious Torrance. But this situation wouldn't last forever. The Ashanti economy relied on slavery and selling slaves to the Westerners. Britain's future interference with this outraged them. It was rather like a Western nation telling modern-day Kuwait or Saudi Arabia to immediately stop selling oil. If you can imagine their reaction, it was the same for the Ashanti. Are you out of your tiny minds? It wasn't until a decade later, in 1817, that the British decided it might be a good idea to send a peacemaking mission from the coast to the mysterious capital of the Ashantis at Kumasi. British officers set out to overawe the supposed savages, dressed in full diplomatic uniform of scarlet jackets and swords. Little did they know, they were the ones about to be impressed. Day after day they travelled north. They saw nothing but devastation, the consequence of the Ashanti's scorched earth fighting strategy. Even Mansu, once the biggest slave mart in West Africa, had been reduced to a few desolate sheds and a small group of, quote, natives gaunt with famine, end quote. Having seen the results of Ashanti fury, they now saw the grandeur of their capital of Kumasi at its very peak. The white men have come to treat with the great king, and you, along with his other faithful bodyguards, the core of the invincible army, have been ordered to show them the might of the Ashanti. They walk through the gate, looking up wide-eyed at the dead sheep, wrapped in red silk, suspended from two poles that they have to walk under. Gingerly they proceed. A drop of crimson sheep's blood falls and hits the leader's face, who rubs it off nervously, looking at the red smears on his hand. Now you and the 5,000 men of the Imperial Guard approach, shouting out your battle cry first. Then the drums start pounding out their deep rhythm, while horns, gongs and rattles add to the wall of noise you send the white men's way. They stand dumbfounded, rendered mute by the cacophony of sound. Now for your finale. As one, you fire your rifles into the sky and charge towards the British, screaming out your war cry. They recoil in fear, but you stop just before you reach them and dance to the mad beat of the drums. Now they know who is top dog on the Gold Coast, the strength of those who follow the golden stool. After this impressive display, the city itself stunned the British. It was huge, like nothing else they'd seen in West Africa, with different sections for trade such as goldsmiths. The city royal palace had elaborately carved doors and windows and even had toilets. Gold seemed to be everywhere, gleaming in the sun. When one of the delegates, Tom Bowditch, described all this in a book about his travels, reviewers called him a liar, claiming no African city could possibly be so grand. Yet the harsher side of the empire was also clearly on display, as the British discovered, quote, a most inhuman spectacle, which was paraded before us for some minutes. There was a man whom they were tormenting previous to sacrifice. His hands were pinioned behind him. A knife was passed through his cheeks, to which his lips were noosed. One ear was cut off and carried before him. The other hung to his head by a small bit of skin. There were several gashes in his back, and a knife was thrust under each shoulder blade. He was led with a cord passed through his nose. The feeling this horrid barbarity excited must be imagined. End quote. Apart from giving us a fascinating insight on the Ashanti Empire at its peak, the mission did little good. A treaty was signed, but it did nothing to resolve the two big issues, and the drift to war went unchecked. When the British departed, the Ashanti attacked their neighbours, the Gammon tribe, with a huge army, closing the paths to the sea for months, so no one on the Gold Coast knew what was happening. A rumour spread that the empire had been defeated, but it was actually false. The Gammon were now either dead or enslaved. However, a coastal tribe believed it was true. They stopped paying tribute and roughed up some Ashanti ambassadors. An order went out from Kumasi to the British. Get your people back in line. The company of merchants did try diplomacy, sending yet another mission under Joseph Dupuy. This time good progress was made and a treaty was signed. All seemed to be going well, except the whole thing was scuttled by a massive childish outburst of jealousy by the local governor, Hope Smith. He had wanted to lead the mission and had sulked terribly when Dupuy got it instead. Hope Smith now refused to abide by any treaty he hadn't helped negotiate, boasting to his flunkies that he got one over on the hated Dupuy. As the two men argued like kids in a playground, the Ashanti were furious. In their eyes, understandably so, Britain had not only been dodging its feudal duties, but was now refusing to obey a treaty it had just signed. Their king had had enough. All trade was now diverted away from the British forts. Instead, it went to their Dutch and Danish competitors. Conditions on the Gold Coast were now in a proper mess, and the company of merchants was on its last legs. The killing blow would be delivered by the arrival of Commodore Sir John Yeo, with a squadron of His Majesty's warships. Yeo hated everything he saw on the Gold Coast. The forts, he complained, were shoddily built and not maintained, while the company officers seemed to be cooking the books and slyly encouraging the illegal slave trade. The charitable missionary school they boasted of funding he denounced as a travesty, claiming, quote, all the boys read English pretty clear and direct, but soon you understand that they do not understand one word they utter. Neither does the schoolmaster understand their language, the Fantee. End quote. Sounds like a recipe for success. The company tried to portray him as an angry hothead. It was a hard charge to make stick against Yeo. He was an extremely cautious man. He had spent most of the War of 1812 on Lake Ontario in a shipbuilding race with his American opponent, Commodore Isaac Chauncey. Neither commander ever felt he had enough ships to challenge the other, so they never fought a battle, though they kept right on building. With that background, his uncharacteristically emotional report raised eyebrows, and the government decided it was time to take control. On May the 7th, 1821, the House of Commons abolished the African Company. Their forts were now under Crown control. The British Empire and the Ashanti now faced each other directly. There were no more middlemen. It would take a talented and skilled governor to prevent a war. Sadly, Britain only had Brigadier General Sir Charles Macarthy. Macarthy was one of those obscure British officers perpetually assigned to the periphery, a decent, proud, but stupid man. He began his career with black regiments in the West Indies, and was later made a lieutenant colonel in the Royal African Corps in 1811. The next year he was named Governor of Sierra Leone. Tall and grey-haired, he was also a bit of a dandy, and adored wearing his plumed hat and scarlet uniform. He had been picked mainly because he was very anti-slavery. Right from the start it was clear it was a bad appointment. He was based in Sierra Leone, which was 900 miles away, and he paid little attention to the Gold Coast until it was too late. Despite having been stationed in West Africa for over a decade, he had little knowledge of the local tribes, and he didn't seem to want to learn. He didn't have expert advisers either to turn to, as those officials who had served the former company of merchants refused to work with him, sulking about losing their forts to the crown. Macarthy arrived in the Gold Coast completely unaware of all the previous history and misunderstandings, dismissing the Ashanti as childish natives, certainly no threat to the greatest empire on earth. As one of his own officials complained, quote, "Macarthy seems to have no idea of the critical condition of affairs, and apparently thought that everything would go smoothly." End quote. The only thing about the Ashanti that Macarthy did know was that they were slave traders. He immediately tried to crack down on the trade, achieving little, but it was enough to deeply annoy the great king. As with so many wars in history, it was a trivial incident that finally ignited a conflict after years of tension. A mixed-race sergeant in Macarthy's newly formed Royal African Colonial Corps, Kujo Otefo, got into a shouting match with an Ashanti trader inside the fort at Ananambo. After the trader mocked Macarthy, the sergeant uttered words that no Ashanti could ever forgive: Cormentine and Saturday. To Westerners, these cryptic words meant nothing, but among the locals, there were few more devastating insults. They referred to a Saturday in 1731, when an Ashanti king had been killed at the Battle of Cormentine. The memory was so traumatic to the Ashanti that even to mention it was an automatic death sentence. Weeks later, King Osei Bonsu heard of this crime and demanded vengeance. The bad-tempered Sergeant Otefo was kidnapped and beheaded. His skull, jawbone, and part of one of his arms were taken back to the Ashanti capital and put on public display. Then the great king sent a personal message to Macarthy that he would face a similar fate as the unfortunate sergeant. The governor threw a fit. A mere native threatening him? How very dare he? It was time to cut these Ashanti down to size. He ordered a punishment expedition to the Ashanti-held town of Donkwa, which turned into a disaster. One of the survivors, Major H.J. Ricketts, later recounted that, quote, "The guides were either traitors or imbeciles, for the troops lost the right road, and after excessive fatigue and want of every sort of provisions, were suddenly attacked under heavy fire by a numerous force of Ashantis, ambushed in a thick, covered wood, on both sides of a very rugged path." End quote. They never did reach Donkwa, falling back on the fort with 6 men dead and 38 wounded. Mystifyingly, Macarthy thought this was a glorious success. I would hate to see what he regarded as a defeat. He boasted that the Ashanti had been, quote, "blustering all along, and they were not prepared for war, but depended solely upon the terror of their name to bring us to seek a compromise that I will not give them." End quote. I am sure the Ashanti were shaking in their boots, General Macarthy. The First Anglo-Ashanti War had begun. A vast army of 10,000 or more highly disciplined Ashantis, most of them carrying their 6-foot long-Dane muskets, manufactured ironically in the UK by Birmingham-based factories, advanced on the British forts. Their drums sounded out across the vast green jungles. McCarthy saw the upcoming fight as a crusade against slavery and boasted that victory was guaranteed. He didn't seem to appreciate just how bad his odds really were. The British had very limited forces available for any kind of war in West Africa. It was used as a punishment post, so most of the troops were of poor quality and morale was low. It also didn't help that the soldiers sent there, especially white troops, died in droves from various diseases. In 1 year alone, half of all the white troops sent to Sierra Leone died. All this meant that McCarthy could only pull together a force of 500 regular troops. He was relying on the Fanti and other local tribes to make up his numbers. This seemed to work. 2,000 tribal warriors joined his army. McCarthy naively assumed they were completely loyal, but they very much remembered Torrance's betrayal from years before. If it looked like the British were going to lose, they would leave them to their fate, fearing McCarthy would do the same to them. It was a very fragile army. The British received intelligence that the Ashanti were pouring down towards the coast, moving through the Waza tribal lands to the west. Rather than trying to keep his already outnumbered army together, McCarthy decided on a complicated strategy of splitting up his force into 3 prongs. One part, under Captain Lang, would pretend to head towards Kumasi, hopefully diverting enemy troops to stop them. Meanwhile, most of the militia and tribal allies, led by Captain Blenken, would march behind the Ashanti and hit them from the rear. Finally, McCarthy would personally lead the remaining troops in a frontal attack. Only 1 officer and a handful of men were left to guard Cape Coast Castle. If anything went wrong, the forts were practically defenceless. Off they marched into the deep, green jungle, with only 20 rounds of ammunition per man. McCarthy was taking a massive gamble. A long, tiring march began, and soon McCarthy was struggling to hold his army together. The heat was heavy and stifling. The seemingly never-ending sea of trees made staying in formation impossible. The thick, green canopy above blotted out the sun itself. The supply situation was a nightmare. Everything had to be carried by locals, but they had little enthusiasm for McCarthy's crusade and took every opportunity to flee into the bush. The army was soon running short of rations, and men complained about their empty stomachs. Morale sank further when the heavens opened and torrential rain poured down. Jungle paths became quagmires of mud, and their vital gunpowder was soaked, leaving it useless. McCarthy then made a truly stupid decision. A message came from tribal allies begging for help. The Ashanti had invaded their lands. The governor had already divided his army once. He now split the fragment he commanded again. A large force under Major Chisholm was sent off to provide help, while McCarthy led his now tiny army ever onwards. As they crossed the Pra River, they met hundreds of warriors from the Waza and Dakera tribes, fleeing the butchery of the Ashanti. The British managed to persuade them to join their army, but not before a wise Dankera chief complained that, quote, there weren't nearly enough men to resist the Ashanti. He was quite sure that the Fantis cannot stand. The whole charge will fall upon the governor and his small force, and the consequence will be the ruin of the Dakera. End quote. They should have listened to the chief. Instead, McCarthy dismissed all his concerns. He was reluctantly persuaded by his officers to recall Chisholm's force, but even this small concession to sanity turned into a moment from a carry-on film. The messenger got hopelessly lost and spent days wandering in the bush. Chisholm didn't get the order until it was far too late. On the 21st of January 1824, disaster finally struck. McCarthy had dismissed his own scouts' claims that the full might of the Ashanti army was heading towards him, claiming instead they were at least 3 days away. It was just a small scouting force they'd seen. But at 2 p.m, The dreaded drums and horns of the Ashanti echoed out. The opposite bank of the Bonza River, in front of the British, now teemed with their warriors. This was no scouting party. It was a 10,000-strong main Ashanti army. You would think being proven dramatically wrong would make McCarthy a bit more modest, but that was not the case. He now claimed confidently that Ashanti morale was weak, and they were just waiting to defect to the British. Where he got this ridiculous idea is a mystery. In one of the most bizarre moments in British colonial history, he sent forward the regimental band to play God Save the King. He seemed to genuinely think that playing the national anthem would lead to mass surrenders of the Ashanti. As a patriotic Brit, I am as fond of our national anthem as any man, but this was massively overestimating its powers. The Ashanti were briefly silent at the spectacle, though they replied in kind with their drums and horns, even louder than before. This musical battle went on for an hour. Each time the anthem was played, McCarthy and his officers stood stiffly to attention, whilst his men looked on in bewilderment. Eventually, the Ashanti got fed up with his musical showdown and began shooting, musket balls ripping through the bush and tearing into British flesh. They killed a number of officers straight away, mainly as they were standing to attention for the national anthem out in the open. McCarthy was an idiot. The British and their tribal allies were being pelted with bullets by the Ashanti. The warriors merged into their surroundings, giving the British nothing to retaliate against. They fired into the jungle, but were unsure if they were actually hitting anything at all. Only when the Ashanti tried to ford the river did they actually have a target to shoot at. The elusiveness and bushcraft of the Ashanti gave the battle its name, Nsamankau. The Fanti, fighting for the British, called the Ashanti ghosts, or Saman, as they could not see who was shooting at them. Soon McCarthy's men were desperately short of ammo. His quartermaster, Brandon, was meant to have brought up more, but he had made a grave mistake. He had left his base with about 40 native carriers, but had gone ahead of them to join McCarthy. The unsupervised carriers, seeing the Wassers, their countrymen, hurrying to the rear, threw down the kegs they were carrying and joined in the retreat. The unfortunate Brandon arrived mid-battle with only a few crates that he carried himself. He even managed to screw this up. Just as in the opening dramatization, the boxes contained macaroni, not bullets. The furious governor threatened to hang Brandon from a tree, but before he could put his threat into action, an Ashanti bullet slammed into Brandon's head, killing him instantly. The British troops and their allies were out of ammunition, and the Ashanti triumphantly crossed the river. The remnants of McCarthy's army fixed bayonets as the horde fell upon them. Most were killed and beheaded where they stood. A lieutenant of the militia, de Graft, rallied a few orderlies and managed to rake the Ashanti lines with musket balls from a small brass cannon just before they were overrun. De Graft managed to fight his way out. The rest were killed. McCarthy, still in his plumed hat, wandered the battlefield like Richard III, calling for a bugler to sound the retreat rather than a horse. His search was in vain. The young lad was already dead. You stagger along the jungle path with the governor and 2 other men, trying to get away, the sound of Ashanti war cries echoing in your ears. You have not gone far, however, when a bullet rips through the bush and strikes your party. Governor McCarthy screams out and clutches his arm as an Ashanti warrior charges towards you, knife raised. Drawing your sword, you run him through. But more warriors soon arrive, and it becomes a bloody battle for survival. You're forced back against a tree, while McCarthy has been hit again in the chest by a slug. He's barely conscious as his clothes are soaked in blood. Ensign Weatherall fires the last round from his gun into an Ashanti warrior's head. Then he throws away his now useless rifle, draws his sword, and hacks at the screaming Ashanti, cutting off one warrior's hand as he tries to grab a shred of McCarthy's uniform as a trophy. Those terrible drums echo out through the jungle. The other soldier, Buckle, is already dead and being beheaded before your eyes as you desperately fight on. But then an Ashanti knife pierces your thigh and a club smashes into your head as you lose consciousness. This is really how McCarthy died. Only Williams, who we met in the dramatisation, survived. He awoke to a warrior trying to clumsily cut off his head. He was only spared this gruesome fate by the intervention of a Ashanti captain who he had once helped on the coast. Williams was taken to an Ashanti village and, quote, shut up each night in a hut with the heads of Sir Charles and the other officers. These heads had been so well preserved that the features of the governor especially presented almost the same appearance as they had done in life. End quote. The Ashantis greatly admired McCarthy's bravery in attacking them with such a small force. As a mark of respect, they cut out and ate his heart, hoping to inherit his courage. Pieces of his flesh were also removed and smoked, then handed out among the army as talismans to protect them in battle. His head was turned into a well-polished skull, and it was brought out each year in early September as a highlight of the Ashanti Yam Festival. Later, it was rimmed with gold and used as a cup. It was one of the more gruesome fates for a British general. It seemed as though there was nothing to stop the Ashanti sweeping the British out of the Gold Coast. At their moment of triumph, however, disaster struck. Dysentery and smallpox outbreaks ravaged the army, scything through their ranks. The great king was forced to turn back to Kumasi, and the British and their tribal allies had been saved for now. If there is one thing that can shake a British government out of its complacency, it's a humiliating defeat. After decades of neglect, the Gold Coast suddenly became a priority. Reinforcements flowed in, and a far more competent governor was sent to steady the ship and avenge the defeat by a so-called army of savages. Major General Charles Turner issued a challenge to the Ashanti, quote, if the king of the Ashanti will content himself with governing his own nation and his own people, and does not stop the trade of the interior with the coast, or attempt to oppress his neighbours, let him say so to me, and I will make a treaty with him on any of these terms. But I will not make peace with him on any other terms, nor until he gives up every claim to tribute or subjection from surrounding nations. End quote. No reply came from the depths of the jungle. As 1825 turned into 1826, the Ashanti king had died, and a new successor was cementing his hold on his throne. But they had noticed, and they were furious. The British had been crushed, and now they were issuing ultimatums? To heaven's chosen people? Never. In January 1826, they swarmed down towards the coast again. Villages were plundered and burned. Anyone caught was enslaved or butchered. But for now, the tribal armies refused to offer battle. Advised by the British, they were luring the Ashanti into a trap. The British weren't going to make the same mistakes as McCarthy. They knew that the Ashanti were masters of jungle warfare. Instead, when battle came, they would fight it on open ground. That gave them the advantage. Finally, on the 7th of August 1826, the new king of the Ashanti, Oseyor Akita, fell into the trap. Camped on the open plains near the town of Dodoma, suddenly the 10,000 strong Ashanti were confronted by an army of 11,000 British and their tribal allies. Despite the British having the advantage, this was going to be an incredibly close battle. The great king had brought the famous golden stool with him, standing beside the very symbol of the Ashanti people. In the centre of the army, he sent a wave of warriors against his enemy's flanks. This time the tribal allies of the British fought well, repulsing the attacks, forcing the Ashanti to attack the British units in the centre. Crashing volleys of British musket balls smashed into their ranks, something the Ashanti were not used to. Soon their advances stalled, and they were slowly forced back. On the flanks, the fighting had become a fierce hand-to-hand struggle, where the warriors wrestled and stabbed and slashed at each other. No quarter was given or expected. Wounded on both sides were killed when they fell, beheaded or clubbed to death. The tribal warriors on the British side took great pride in ripping out the hearts of the dead Ashantis. In the centre, the British advance temporarily stalled thanks to an Ashanti chief's act of bravery. He detonated a keg of gunpowder, blowing up himself and some of the British as well. Still, soon they were advancing again, heading towards the king and the precious golden stool, while Ashanti resistance became fanatical. But as the Allies advanced, their men began to stop and claim spoils from the fallen Ashanti warriors, breaking up their formations. The great king saw his opportunity and unleashed a fresh reserve force armed with the infamous Long Dane rifles. As the British and their tribal allies began to fall, the tide was turning and the battle hung in the balance. It was then that the British unleashed a new weapon, concrete rockets. The noise and smoke of the missiles as they shot through the air, and the huge explosions as they landed, terrified the Ashanti. Having never seen them before, the warriors believed the British were controlling actual thunder and lightning. Panic set in, and they finally broke and fled. Even the golden stool was almost captured, saved only by 2 chiefs sacrificing themselves in suicidal charges. After a bad start and a tough fight, Britain and its allies were victorious. The Ashanti were forced to give up their claims to the coast. No longer would Britain pay rent for its forts. Having avenged Nsamanko, British attention turned elsewhere, but the Ashantis never forgot. They licked their wounds, rebuilt their armies, and they waited for the right opportunity. It would take 4 more wars for the British to finally break Ashanti resistance and incorporate their lands into their Gold Coast colony, today's Ghana. Even then, Ashanti defiance continued until independence. During World War I, Britain created a Gold Coast regiment and asked Ashanti warriors to join it. They turned right back and said, "Go to hell." Thanks for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. I'd like to thank my friend Steve, who made me aware of this war in the first place and gave me a great book to help me write the script. Thanks, mate. I'll be taking next Monday off as it's the Easter bank holiday, and will return on Monday the 13th of April. After that, there'll be no more breaks until August. In the next episode, we're covering the most daring German commando raid of World War II, Operation Panzerfaust. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.